This next Porch Story features Robert Pelant, who's the director of the Pacific Rim Institute outside of Coupeville, and this was recorded July 10th, 2019.
But I'm Robert Pelant. I'm the director of the Pacific Rim Institute, and I know some of you have been out there, but have you folks been out? Have you heard of it before?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay. So you're local, or?
Yes. We're Townsend.
Okay. All right. Great. Some great prairie over there, the Kai-Tai, and yeah, really wonderful. But well, just a quick overview. We're a private nonprofit organization, and we manage the 175 acres there at the prairie, mostly prairie. It's a big L-shaped property with a forest on both ends, mostly Doug fir, but we've got even 400-year-old Pacific yews on the site, and also where traditionally where the Doug fir comes onto the prairie, it's kind of increasing in the last 100, 200 years because of the lack of fire. And I'll touch on that again in a minute. But so that's kind of a savanna area. If you would define savanna by, let's say, less than 20% canopy cover of the forest over the ground. So a typical Douglas fir forest, you go in over there or something like that, would be 80 to 100, almost 100, nothing's 100, but 80+% canopy cover, shade all the time. And when you get down to 15 to 20, that's kind of like a savanna. So different species of birds and animals and plants survive and thrive a little bit better in some savanna conditions. One is the bluebird. The western bluebird is a classic example, the Gary Oak savannas that we used to have here. But I'll come back into that again. But so we've had the site for, we've actually purchased it and made the last payment 4.5 years ago, December of 2014. So our next main step in that area is to get a conservation easement on the property, so that no matter what happens, no matter if something should happen to us or what have you, that it has a set of guidelines, and it's an easement protection that's would be held by, let's say, perhaps a government agency, maybe U.S. Fish and Wildlife or the Department of Natural Resources. Could be done through a lawyer, it could be done through Whidbey Island Land Trust or what have you, but it would stipulate a number of things, mostly things that you can't do. Like maybe no more deep plowing of the land or something like that. It could be something to do with forests and harvesting of trees, maybe on a percentage basis or something like that. What conservation easements don't do, or at least as I understand them, they don't do, is guarantee any kind of a heart or level of competency of what the next owner of the site might do with it. You can't guarantee someone's going to have a green thumb. You can't put in there, you will plant, 20,000 of these endangered species every year or something like that. So that's the next major thing as far as the overall site and everything else. We have, our mission is all about sustainability and living well in a community, and the sense of the community being the broader community, the natural world around us, as well as our human relationships, okay? And our perspective is, we come from a Christian perspective. We offer courses and deal with students from Christian colleges as well. But as far as engaging the public, it's purely about caring for the earth and caring for the environment. And so we don't proselytize, but that's just a definition, if you will, of who we are and where we come from. And that basically, obviously, for all of us, that formulates how we live and how we want to try to live, at least, and communicate. And so for us, a focus is really about relationships. If you have a piece of land, and the Native Americans always said that, well, we're caring for this through the next 7 generations, right? And now we have titles and you actually own the land, quote unquote. Well, try not paying your property taxes for a couple of years. So in any event, the real message, of course, is that we are stewards, we're caretakers. And my perspective is that we live in a created world and that we're stewards, we're called to be stewards or caretakers of the earth around us and the communities around us, which includes people. So we're not environment first at all costs, and wouldn't Earth be great if we could just get rid of all the people? That's not us, okay? That's some groups, right? And but we also are not attempting to go back in time to some romantic, idyllic past that we think existed, right? And so we're not dealing with our land to try to make it just like it was in 1840 or something like that. We understand full well that we live in the 21st century. We have many different things going on Whidbey Island now that are different and will continue to be different. People's geographic mobility, for example, coming and going, vehicles, roads, all these kinds of things, communication, it changes the whole landscape and lifescape for the world in which we live, right? So we still, though, are analog, if you will, old-fashioned, you might say, in terms of trying to grasp, learn, understand, and care about the fundamental aspects of the way the world works. Because, you know, we have how did we ever survive without cell phones, without knowing that you're supposed to pick up celery on the way home from work or something like that, right? Now, I can't even hardly remember not having a cell phone. You know, it's like you need it, you have to call, you have to check the information, we've got to know the weather 7 times a day and all these different things. And the fact is that we've gotten ahead of the game technologically, right? And that's brought a lot of wonderful things, But also, it can lead us into the trap that that's the way the world works, when in fact, the world still has the carbon cycle, the hydrogen cycle, the water cycle. And the way the natural world works is not like our corporate world where you have like the organizational chart is a pyramidal chart, you know? Who makes the most money, right? Up here, right? And there's a lot more down here. Well, the lion may be the king of the jungle, but like Mustafa tells Simba, you know, we turn to grass and the antelope eat us eventually, right? And so these cycles, and I know in the West, I've lived in Latin America and Asia a number of times, and we like to think linearly, you know, like, oh, tell me the job, I'll get it done, bang, bang, bang. And a lot of cultures think more in a circular way, and perhaps some of it is their belief in reincarnation or what have you, but it is an interesting thing to observe if you're spending any time in another culture where they may not think as linearly as we do. And of course, the world doesn't work in that linear way. We produce a lot of waste now. In the natural world, there's essentially no waste. There's literally no waste. And there's a short supply lines. Now we want something, boom, we get it from Amazon, you know, and it's here. We don't even know where it's made or where it's, you know, being shipped from, things like that. We just know that we want it in 2 days. And I'm not saying all those things are bad. I'm just saying that's the context in which we live. And the challenge that we have, because really, I mentioned the word relationships. And so if you could say, well, what are you really about? Forget the mission statement and the jargon and all this kind of thing. It's about building relationships and reestablishing relationships. So we try to reach out to our nearby community. That is all the areas, you know, the housing developments or neighborhoods that are within a mile of us, let's say, or a mile or two. We put a little more energy and effort and focus on reaching out to them and engaging those folks because they're adjacent to us, and ecology doesn't know political boundaries or property boundaries or county lines, right? And so that's real important to us. Also, I said because of our belief that this world was created by a creator, whatever you want to call the creator, is that then we believe we have a relationship with that creator, but also the rest of the world was created. And not to sound silly or whatever, but we believe that the rest of creation also has a relationship with the creator. So who are we to say that every time an orca jumps up is because it wants to get rid of some barnacles? I don't know, maybe they're just having fun, you know, and praising their creator. I don't know that anybody could disprove that right now, but so the point I'm getting at is that as we interact with the natural world around us, we should be a little more humble and not just see ourselves in the complete control driver's seat of everything that goes on. First of all, for obvious reasons, we know so little about plants and animals and the natural world around us, really. We probably, like they say, we know more about the surface of the moon than the bottom of the ocean, right? Or maybe even the 12 inches of soil that we have here. And so that's pretty interesting. That's rather humbling. As we learn more about the fungal relationships and soil structures and things, it's very eye-opening and makes us change a little bit of our paradigms, or maybe think about, hopefully, the way we live. And that's really tough. Changing habits and behaviors and things is really difficult. I found really the only way you can change someone's behavior is to get married to them. Then they change right after the wedding. It's amazing. Yeah, that's tough. So part of it is the humility to say, you know, we know some things, but we don't know it all by any means. And let's always be observant and listening, okay? And that as we do things, and we can do things at a pretty big scale, like with a bulldozer in an area, pretty quickly, disrupt a lot of things there. But as we do things like wanting to restore the land around us, okay, we have to realize that in some cases, with some aspects of things, the best thing might be to do nothing, right? Or to take small steps and, you know, work at scale instead of large scale projects. You know about the North Pacific Gyre, or Gyre, whatever, you know, this floating massive groups of islands of plastic that's, I don't know how deep, and well, would you like to do something about that? Okay, well, even if you won the lottery, I wouldn't put a lot of hope in your single ability to probably do something about that. But could you do something about your life and your community and your beach and your use of plastics? And so that's the point. We probably bit off more than we could chew in a couple of cases on our site, where we thought, okay, we've got enough seed, we can do this, let's do 5 acres at a time and try to prepare the land for all this seed and things like that. Well, you know, if something goes wrong at 1/4 of an acre, it's a lot different than if something goes wrong, or doesn't pan out, actually, for us, what happened in this case. Doesn't pan out as well as you thought it would. We didn't get a lot of great germination from seeds that year. At 5 acres, wow, you know, you got to step back and really recover from that, right? And so what I'm saying is that as we try to engage with the way the world works, we're trying to observe how the natural world around us is actually surviving and thriving and not thriving in today's world, and try to work with that. We have some native species that are just taking over parts of the prairie. No, that's usually the category of weeds, isn't it? Didn't all the native species run away when we came in here with agricultural grasses and inadvertently tons of weed seeds as well? Canada thistle, Scotch broom, all these things, spurge laurel. Well, no, they didn't. The playing field was changed, and I'll get to that in a second. But so it's just really observing and knowing that we're passing through and trying to change ourselves, obviously, is the only thing that you can really do, and that's tough. But to be an example, we want to influence people. I think of the word influence is quite similar to leadership. And if you can be a positive influence on people's life, that's a good thing, hopefully positive. And you know, you can go try to be a positive influence on an old dog like me, or you can engage 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds, and it's quite interesting. As we engage through the classes, there almost seems to be a period in elementary school, a level where all of a sudden there's it seems to me like a significant drop in creativity and more of a conformity to standard things, and maybe also a bit of over confidence of knowledge. And for me, I've seen that at the 3rd to the 5th grade level. And we probably all read, you know, studies where we lose most of our creativity by the time we're 4 or 5 years old. But you know, those are things that we can work on. And there's nothing like standing or sitting out in a prairie for an hour or two, or in a forest, a quiet forest, and just looking around and listening, really listening, that some of this creativity can come back. It's not like it's lost forever. We just have to give it a chance, right? And so our programs are really, our work, our presence there is meant to be hopefully a positive example, a positive influence on the community, on people that come by, on the land and the wildlife around us. And we do that through a number of means and methods. They're just programs, but it's restoring the land is one thing. Providing formal and informal education is another one. We have classes that'll start on Monday for college students, 29 college students from 22 different colleges and universities across Canada and the US. And they're here for 5 weeks, and they get a real immersive, hands-on, out in the field experience and adventure and opportunity to learn in what we know are much more powerful ways of influencing people, and to have people do things, have people touch things, have people be out in the classroom of the world, the forest, the sea, right? And so the other things that we do, we have informal workshops, and we primarily those are the basic things, the education, but the hands-on. And we wouldn't want to do the education unless we were doing the restoration work ourselves on the site. So what is that? Well, I can go through it from 2 perspectives. One is just the steps involved, sort of like the life cycle of, right? And another way would be just to go with the philosophy. But let me start with the life cycle, and then we could maybe branch into something if you have a question or a thought or a comment. But right now we're collecting seeds of native plants. We can collect the seeds of over 40 species of native plants on our site, in the wild, on our site. And then we have also nursery beds where we grow them and collect there. We have about 5 properties, 7 on Whidbey Island, where we've noticed native plants in their backyards and knocked on their door, and they've not mowed that area until we can collect seeds. They've been really cooperative that way, and some of them are extremely rare seeds and plants. So we collect them, we clean them, we label, we store them, and then in the fall is when we outplant. On the climate, with the climate here, we will either grow plants as starts in these little plastic tubes, and they'll be about that, the plant itself will stick up about that much, and we'll outplant these starts out in an area that's been prepared, or we'll seed that area. And we're always evolving our seed mix because, well, it'll never end, because you never get the same fall, winter, spring 2 years in a row. And so what's successful one year, you know, might not be as successful the next year, not because you didn't put the right seeds or the right amount, but just because of weather. We had a double frost. I don't know if some of those of you around here. We had a double frost in February, I think it was, with a nice warm period in between. That really created havoc out by us. But we'll grow plants and we sell them. We work with the National Park Service over at Edie's Landing at the Overlook. We work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to help recover the endangered golden paintbrush, which is Washington's listed endangered species. We work with the University of Washington, Washington State University, Bureau of Land Management. We recently did a survey of 35 islands in the San Juans, or parts of the islands that belong to the San Juan National Monument. President Obama, a few years back, signed into law that the San Juan would become a national monument. Well, that's not all the land. It's the land that's owned by the public entities So it might be a few rectangles on San Juan Island, but as you probably know, there's islands that are, smaller than the footprint of this museum, right? And so we rented motorboats and went out there and did botanical, biological surveys for the Bureau of Land Management. Which is needed by law. If you create a national monument, you have to do that kind of thing. So we'll grow plants for those kinds of efforts, or barter seeds, typically with other organizations that are doing restoration work around the region. We don't get plants or seeds from outside of about a 50 to a 75-mile radius. There's enough to deal with in that regard. So we don't try to bring in things that we haven't been able to identify have been here, or there's not some botanical reference that someone found it on Goose Rock in 1897, of which we have a lot of that. A lot of people found things in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, but no one's seen one in the last 75, 100 years. So maybe a little more about us and our site. We're pretty much open 7 days a week, but you can certainly, excuse me, you can certainly come out and walk our trails anytime. They're more fun during the day, but owls, we got owls too. We have over 2 miles of trails, and you just can come into our place and park and walk the trails. If there's someone around, you're welcome to engage the staff, and if you have people or relatives that are coming in or friends, you want to do a tour, we'd be glad to either take you out and do a 1 to 2 hour walkabout, and or go out part way with you and then leave you on your own. Whatever you prefer. We have, like I said, we have workshops. We hope we've done the Whidbey Island Cider Festival a couple of years now. In the fall, we have Whidbey Raptor Day, where you can come out and maybe hold a red-tailed hawk or something like that, and listen to the falconers and watch the birds fly. Pretty exciting. But there's one thing that, sometimes we do all sorts of complex things in our life, but they all kind of come together toward one focus and things. And as we talk about trying to restore the land, and what does that even mean, and why would we want to do something like that? Because in this work, you have to have a real big reason why. Because it's slow, you need perseverance, you need to be an old cuss. It's just, you're going to get punched, you're going to get stepped on and pushed back, and just it's just a long, tedious, slow process. Partly because you're working with the way the world works, and it doesn't work on our digital time frame. And but you could say one of the key things that we're about that radiates out would be pollinators. And it's not just honeybees, but many of the bumblebees and flies and moths and butterflies, even some birds and spiders can be pollinators. But largely it's the bees and flies, and butterflies. They're the large ones. Well, how can we affect them? We could start bee colonies and raise bees and release them, right? We could raise butterflies and release them. We could raise salamanders and Pacific garter snakes and release them. Or we can intervene at a common crossing point where there's a lot of coming and going. You kind of think of like the Silk Road back in the days, and there were towns and like Samarkand and these other places that, you know, conjure up romantic images of caravans and things. Well, people were coming and going, but it was a common, you know, catch-all, right? And that for us is the native plants. And because the native plants reflect and are connected to the rest of the web of the life directly in most cases for people and animals and birds and what have you, pollinators, or if not directly, very close, maybe one step away. And so that's where we've decided to put our energy and our efforts into that, because by affecting that, we believe that the radiant effect through the web can be very, very powerful. And so why do we need native plants? Well, many of the native pollinators, and in this case bumblebees, but many others, are dependent on native plants. Some will not collect pollen or nectar from all of our beautiful introduced, you know, lovely horticultural plants, which are great to have and great to plant. There's no doubt about that. But they don't serve as widely the population of native bees and flies, for example. And so why, okay, so, well, therefore, we've got honeybees. Why is it important to have the native bees? Well, they all fill different niches. And, you know, it's like the Washington's endangered golden paintbrush plant is endangered, and guess what? The butterfly, the Taylor's checker spot butterfly that deposits its eggs on that, and the larvae develop, they need that plant for their food source. So one goes, the other goes. And you can imagine the chain reaction, right? Our savannas have been pretty much gone. If you read the literature of early explorers, they'll talk about Oak Harbor and Penn Cove, Coopville area. They were like, this is like a parkland in London. And what we believe they were talking about was the Gary Oaks Savannah landscape, Oak Harbor, right? Gary Oaks. And it basically was clusters of 4 or 5 oaks, and then 50 yards, and maybe another cluster of 3 or 4, and then another 75 yards over there. And all underneath was the blue camas or the yellow western buttercup and Oregon sunshine and what have you. And you can imagine that would look pretty gorgeous. Well, they have horizontal branches, and that's what the bluebirds are looking for. Bluebirds just won't hang out in a shrub like this or a Doug fir. I mean, if they have to stop, they'll stop. But we have some areas where we still left a little bit of fence from when it was the pheasant farm. And that's where we see bluebirds every year they come through. For 10, 12 years, they haven't nested in our area. But they come in May, and we see them, and they're always sitting on the horizontal fences. So we think, you know, maybe, oh, we've lost the oaks, but there's so much more. There's a huge ecosystem emanating all the way back to people and all the way down to the soil and the structure and the way the soil, our source of life, really operates and survives. So, share with you a couple things. These are getting long in the tooth. This one, anybody know this plant? It's horticultural. It's kind of senescing. It's going to seed and kind of dying back a little bit. The seeds will be in these pods here. Self-heal, prunella. Oh, have you heard of that? Oh. Yeah, I mean, there's a horticultural variety of that. And you can cut the heads, and it's got actual peer-reviewed scientific research that this is a very good tonic and has healing properties. And it can be made and used into a salve or a cream for cuts and bruises and scrapes and things. And I've used it, and then there's absolutely no doubt that it speeds up the healing. As I get older, I find my cuts don't heal as quickly as they used to. But I was really surprised by this. And the flowers there, and these are great attractors of the native bees, as well as honeybees. But so that's...
What was the other name besides prunella?
Self-heal. Self-heal. And then, as with so many of the native plants in our world, as well as some of the others, the horticultural ones, they have so many uses. Anybody have an idea roughly what this is?
Is that onion?
Allium? What kind of allium? It's called nodding onion, and you can see it kind of nodding over with the flowers there, and it's about to go to seed. Some of these they'll have a bunch of little black seeds, just like onion seeds, right? Okay, it's allium, and we have 2 types of wild onion here in this part of the country, and these have been used as a food source for millennia. And we dig them up and eat them as well. You know, they're very delicious. In fact, we sell some to Oyster Catcher from time to time for their menu. But these are fabulous, great native plants. And we just recently had 2 different tribal groups out, and we dug the blue camas. And one of the groups stayed overnight, and we made a fire pit, and we cooked it for 24 hours, and we ate the camas, which is like the staple for millennia here. Like for us, it's like people look at us and, you know, I lived in Thailand and they said, here comes the bread eater, you know, because they're rice eaters, right? You know, I'm just joking. And wheat, right? You could say wheat is one of our staples for sure. And rice for others. Well, camas was the carbohydrate staple for the natives throughout the region for millennia. But that's a lovely native, and it's just so interesting because there are so many uses of these different native plants. Stinging nettle, my goodness, it's probably one of the most useful plants of all the native plants on site. And actually, here's another oddball. Do you know plantain? English plantain? We have 2 types here. Well, that's introduced. It's not native. But that also is a phenomenally adaptive plant. But with stinging nettle, for example, you can get your antioxidants, your vitamins, great other just general nutrition from leafy greens, and you can also make string, rope, and literally by braiding and weaving, you can take small strings and weave them together and literally make rope thick enough to hold a 50-foot boat at bay, you know.
Is it like hemp?
I'm sorry?
Is it like hemp?
Yeah, in many ways it is. Yeah, you would strip off, right, exactly. And in fact, to stay awake, like the Maca out on Nia Bay and other groups, if they were going seal hunting, they would want to stay awake all night. And so the men would rub stinging nettle all over their bodies to sort of like keep them awake. Too bad they didn't have coffee back then, right? So the volume of medicines, clothing, fiber, tools, you name it, it's almost endless. And so the people that preceded us here and lived here since the glaciers retreated were not only very intelligent ecologists, but they were purposefully managing the landscape. So I've had neighbors come by, you know, after 6 months, maybe they've just moved in and they're across the road from us or something, and say, you know, I see you guys going out here and doing this and doing that and everything, you know, why not just let it go back to nature? And I pointed out what nature was. Scotch broom and Canada thistle, right? And call it a curse, but we live in the remnants of what was a managed landscape, an intentionally managed landscape. And for the purposes of generating medicine, food, items for spiritual use, what have you, right? Clothing, bedding, what have you. And so we just can't turn that off. Now, we have turned it off, but for us to regenerate that, and we have state parks that we want to be good representatives of our native flora and fauna, right? And then you have places like the Pacific Rim Institute and conservation organizations doing work in different parts of the country and the world, the Nature Conservancy, things like that. Well, in many places, most places around the world, certainly in this part of the country, all of our prairies were anthropogenic, all human influenced. And we're down to less than 1% though. And so on Whidbey, we're below 1% of what was here just 200 years ago. And so it's like, well, you know, we've survived through that, and we've, you know, why not? If there's prairies over in Squim and prairies over in Snoqualmie, you know, what's the problem? What if we lose a little bit here? And again, it's because that in the natural world, it doesn't work on the linear network kind of system, and the natural world all has short supply lines. You know, that's why our resident orca, are staying in this area. But if we disrupt the Chinook population after some point, it's not going to be a pretty story. Fortunately, we had some good news, right? I think 2 or 3 were born this year.
Yeah.
And so, wow, you know, that's exciting stuff. But every time, you know, it's a law of thermodynamics. For every action, there's a reaction, right? If I do that, you know, something happened. The wood vibrated, and maybe at an absolute minuscule scale, because of that, the nails just popped up, you know, a millionth of a micron, right? So there's always a reaction to our actions.
How are the sheep doing? And what are they doing?
Yeah. Okay, right now they're down at the Max Welton area, and because they've got some seepage down there near the drainage, and so they've got some pastures that are a little bit greener and things like that. But what we're trying to do is do a rotational grazing with the sheep to mimic herds that move through an area, another natural practice that occurred along with fire. And then the idea being that with cover cropping of agricultural plants, we'll have sheep graze for anywhere between 2 to 5 years. And then we're going to start to experiment by saying, if this is the pasture, we might say, let's do a 1/4 acre, and whatever that is, we'll either take it out of the corner or do a strip along one edge, and we'll take that out of the rotational grazing and hit it heavy with native plant seeds. The other thing is we're going to introduce a couple of species into their grazing areas and see how they use or don't use those native plants, and how well do the native plants work in there. We have a lot of historical data and some current research and data that you know, gives us great confidence that some of those some of those plants will coexist quite nicely with the sheep, maybe even a mutual benefit. And so, yeah, they'll be back in the fall, and then the lambing usually occurs in April, and so that's always a fun time to come out and see them. But our hope is to mimic some of those natural processes through grazing. And where we'll come in then with native seeds is that we'll work with the shepherd to see if he would be open to actually a slight bit of overgrazing one time right before we go in with the seeds again. And the idea is to give the native plants an opportunity, and you're not sowing them into this you know, into the shrubs here, where they're going to have competition for water and sunlight, right? That's another thing that we've done. We've tried some experiments, and we're going to ramp it up this year one more time, and then we're going to try to really go on a larger scale, like maybe an acre or more at a time, where we've just gone and slightly rototilled about 3 inches deep. So we're not affecting the soil structure per se, just the top root zone of the grasses and things like that. We've rototilled it down, turned around, rototilled it back, and then sown seeds on that. And just in a small area, small rectangle. And it's amazing. One site we have after 13 years still has held its own around all the weeds around it. Because you'd never, if you want a little prairie in your backyard, well, you could do that, but you'd have to keep the area around it mowed just because the massive weed seed infestation, right? Well, this totally surprised us. It held its own against all those weed seeds. And now there are 6 additional species in this rectangle. I mean, from me to you and as wide as this. 6 additional native plant species in there, and 3 of them are nowhere to be found within 100 yards of that. So, you know, there's all sorts of postulation. Did something get dragged on the leg of a deer? You know, like some of the seeds are burr-like, right? Or did a bird bring something, or what have you? But it's fascinating, and we're going to replicate that. We're going to do 30 test plots this year and see, because the point is that the current protocol for restoration, supported by Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Department of Agriculture, is basically to take an area and nuke it, right, with chemicals, kill it all off. And then when it comes back up, hit it again. And then maybe twice again the next year. And then in the fall, sow it with native plant seeds. Well, that's all, you know, technically on paper, you know, opinions and scientific fact on the side for the second. You know, on paper that sounds, okay, plausible. Obviously, you have all the secondary effects of chemicals on the applicator. Some of them, I think there's enough peer-reviewed research in that shows that some of them actually break down into natural ingredients within 24 to 36 hours, and they're not getting into our water supply, some of them. But still, it's what's the immediate effect on pollinators and ants and what have you, and on the applicators. So it's toxic stuff, right? And the other thing is it's high labor, high intensive. You need, you know, big tractors and sprayers and all these things, and you're not getting any feedback. You're not getting any feedback for about 2 years. And then you put in thousands of dollars equivalent of seed that you've collected. Right? If you count volunteer hours at $22 an hour, which the National Charities Information Bureau says is the legitimate number, and like if some grants we have, they'll allow us to count volunteer hours at $22 an hour as a match, right? And so if you count our volunteer hours, we're putting on thousands of dollars of seed in a 3-acre area. And then we still wait another 6-7 months to get any feedback. And the beauty about this smaller scale, local approach, not 5 acres, but smaller, maybe a 1/4 acre at a time or so, is that we've got very low amount of labor, very low amount of capital equipment, and you do have the seeds, but then you get your feedback in 6 months. And again, that's closer, as I see it, to the way that the world works. In the real world, we get our feedback really quickly. You know, in I guess one example I can think of is that I had a math class my first year in college, which was basically a repeat of my senior year in high school math class. And so, boy, I didn't really study very much for that class, and I went to class, but it was pretty easy, just breezing through and to take the exam at the end. And we can do that in general. We're not, you don't have to go to class, you don't have to study, but eventually you're going to pay the piper, right? Eventually the results are going to come in for what you were going, 3 months for, seemingly fine. And then, boom, you get the feedback, right, for goofing off all semester. Well, if you ate death camas instead of the blue camas, you were dead right away. And, you got that feedback right away. And so my point is that we're trying to seek methods that are more in tune with the way the world works, in that, and seeking for those methods that actually do give a more immediate feedback, because then that can reduce our labor, our costs, and increase our efficiency and effectiveness to try to bring back a more healthy, functional ecosystem that can serve a much wider variety of wildlife. When we got there, the fences were up and they were chicken wire. And 2 feet into the ground, bent 90 degrees and went another foot. 11 miles of fence we've removed, a post at a time. 11 miles of fencing off that site. And all of a sudden, it became much more functional for coyotes and deer. Rabbits, they had little holes here and there, and the voles could get through the 1-inch chicken wire, right? Birds could fly, and they would find a way in a, whatever. Or the nylon flight netting, which lasts about 400 years in the ground, was broken and stuff like that. But it became a much more functional prairie, even though we only had the 4-acre native remnant, an old growth prairie on our site, where it was discovered that we know we have over 80 species in 4.5 acres. It's a treasure. It's a jewel of the Pacific Northwest. Very important parcel. But all the rest of it was just agricultural grasses and what we call weeds, a plant you don't like, right? And it was a functional prairie. Hawks were doing fine. They were doing great. The voles were still in there. Voles happy to munch on an orchard grass as much as it is on something else, right? And so it became functional just by removing all that fencing, but not to the degree and not to the multi-dimensional aspect that it can be, and it is becoming, when we can reintroduce components that have been there for thousands upon thousands of years. So a lot of it is simply learning what's there, trying to learn the way these plants and fit into the greater ecology, trying to think more and more like an ecologist, processes, time, right? All layers and levels, ramifications, all these things, and increase the biodiversity. That's if we can, through our actions, increase biodiversity, even though we don't know as much as maybe we like to think we know, and I mean the broad professional restoration community, right? They know, some of them know quite a bit, but even if we don't have all the answers, which we don't, it is known and proven again and again and again all around the world that where you can increase the biodiversity, that the ecosystems from the water cycle through the soil, through plant life, animal life, bird life, all would be agreed through any culture or language would come up with the word enhanced or improved. And so that's an input. We can affect this broader web through the native plants, through education, through trying to live in a reasonable way, and to know our environment. So we're about place. We are about our place. I can't do anything for Tanzania at the moment other than not throw bottles in the ocean and stuff like that. But I can do something for the place I'm living, and that's one of the messages we want to, that you can. Don't lose hope. There's a lot of hope that can be had.
Can you give us an example of the name of the course that these students come to?
Yeah, they're coming for 6 courses. They'll take 2 courses for 2 days a week, each course, and then every Wednesday is what's called an integrative day. And we bring all the professors and all the students together, and we've created different field trips and experiences to force them all to think circularly and horizontally, and not just, I'm in physics, I don't need to know, well, I was going to say math, but that's a joke. Of course you need to know math if you're studying physics. But get them out of their silos of their disciplines and come across. And the courses are marine biology, marine mammals, alpine ecology, international development, forest ecology, and ecological or sustainable agriculture. So there's 6. And students will take one of a group of 3 and then the other of a group of 3. And they're, yeah. So it's really, you can take a marine biology course in Kansas, with the internet, with YouTube, right? I mean, you can take a course and really learn some things and have some knowledge, useful knowledge. But, to change their lives, they don't know it, but that's what we're about. We really want to shock them a little bit, and give them an opportunity to quiet down, leave the cell phones and the iPads, and just have a little sense of awe and wonder, which we seem to
Are you wearing,
lose.
are you wearing headsets when you're out in the field?
I'm sorry.
Are you wearing headsets when you're out in the field?
Why so? Because of the jets?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when they're out in our field, if they were flying, they'd probably go back into the classroom or go do a field trip somewhere else. Yeah, it's very difficult to communicate outside. But the alpine ecology, they're going to Mount Rainier. They're going, obviously, we don't have alpine here. We're at the lofty 220-foot level in the Pacific Rim. So,
but you must provide them with some opportunity to get their hands dirty right there.
Yes.
On the site. Right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you assign them certain labor.
Well, we offer that.
Or something right there.
Right. We offer volunteer opportunities. Some come back the next year as interns, and then we have like these service learning opportunity days. Right. And oftentimes it's on our site, but sometimes it's for like the food bank on the south end or something like that. Yeah.
So do you dedicate part of your site out there for basic agricultural crops?
Right. Someone asked, what's your goal to, have native plants right up to Parker Road and, maybe even some on the driveway that you can drive with. Well, that'd be nice, but I would see, keeping 5 to 10, maybe even 15 acres in more of kind of an animal agriculture. It doesn't exclude native plants, though. In that kind of a mix. And we always want to be doing something and being transparent about that which we're doing or not doing and explain why we're not, so that when people come out, we can interpret a lot more. We just did an interpretive plan for our site on, guiding us on how can we better share the mission, the vision, the story, not just put up a sign, this is a blue camas, it's a bulb, Native Americans ate it, but to grab people more at the emotional, cognitive level. We study the cognitive, right? The affective, emotional, but there's the third branch of psychology, which just dropped off the edge of the world except for the Colby family, and it's called the conation, the cognitive. And that's not how we feel, affective, or not how we think, the cognitive, but what drives us to act and do. And it's absolutely fascinating, actually. And but that's where we want to interact with students as well. Because, you can go to a concert or a sermon or a lecture and be all inspired. Wow, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to do this. Maybe by the time you get to the car, it's like, no, I got a dentist appointment or something. Yeah. So inspiring, that's good. Equipping is good. But just because you've equipped someone doesn't mean they're going to use the tools, right? And they have to be a participant if you're going to equip them. We don't profess to be able to do anything to anybody if they're not in the game, right? It's like there's no teacher if there isn't a student, right? And it's not what the teacher says or does or shows, it's how much the person wanting to learn engages in that. That's my philosophy.
So you still have plants for sale?
I'm sorry?
Do you still have plants for sale?
Yes, we do actually. We have a whole slew out there. Okay. Out right there as you pull in by the main sign up to the buildings and things. Probably 8 to 10 different species and things like that. And they're all fine for outplanting now if you would want to do them in a decorative area like around your house where you could keep an eye on them and stuff. Because if it doesn't rain for the next 3 months, you're going to want to, you don't want to lug water out to your back 40. But these are all for outplanting in September, October, and set and forget. Yeah, they're adapted. That's a really nice thing about them. In fact, we started to decorate about 5 years ago around our campus, and do native plant landscaping. And there's one bed that just produces seeds by the volume every year. I think we've watered it once in like 5 years. So there's advantages to these native plants. Yeah, I think we're kind of winding down, but
I have one more.
Yeah.
You talked about grazing as a method to help mimic the processes. Yeah. Are you able to describe that?
Yes, and thank you. We have reintroduced burning, as far as I know. It was not done for decades, if not over a century, on Whidbey. But in 2008, we started doing controlled burns. And we hope to have one this August. People are welcome to come on out. We have, safe areas and all that. And we'll have 2 to 3 fire trucks and water tanks and 10 to 15 people from the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, and another partner organization. And we mow breaks, and then we wet them down, and they back burn. And we burned through the Gary Oaks, our Gary Oaks, 2 years ago. It was quite fascinating. And to see what happens right after the burn, and then a month after the burn, and 6 months after the burn, with the plant population is absolutely fascinating.
Were all your Garys planted by you guys?
Yeah. Yeah, there was no evidence of one having lived there. But if you look at the map, they go from Northern California to British Columbia. It's possible that none ever were right there. But
are there still quite a few? Are there Gary Oak groves on Whidbey Island?
Yes. There's if you go to Oak Harbor and you go behind the post office, up the hill into the neighborhoods in there, it's basically, if you take 40 blocks by 20 blocks, there's massive 200-year-old, 100, 200-year-old Gary Oaks, like 2 per housing lot.
Wow.
And then there's a park called Smith Park, and it's about a square block of Gary Oaks. Yeah, but that's about it. If you look at old maps of Oak Harbor, it can get sad because the canopy's pretty much gone.
One just thing that amazes me when you hear that camas was such a important food crop for the Native Americans, and you see a bulb that's about that big. You wonder, how could they possibly collect enough for a family of 4 even, and then you realize how many hundreds of acres of camas probably used to grow around.
Yeah, maybe 8,000 on Whidbey alone.
Yeah.
The Sklallam used to come over, and maybe for the first time, they don't have any record of it, the current leaders. It might be the first time in 150, 200 years that the Sklallam have come over to Whidbey Island to harvest and eat camas, which was on our site in May. And next year, it'll be in our newsletter. People are welcome to come out and harvest a little bit with the different tribes, and if you want to stick around or come back the next day, eat a little, it's quite fascinating. And here's some stories. But
they bury it and roast it.
Pardon?
They bury it and roast it in the fire pit.
Yeah, you dig a fire pit, you burn over rocks, and then you try to get much of the ash and stuff out of there. You lay sword fern, skunk cabbage, and salal, and then you wrap your nodding onions and your camas and maybe chocolate lily and other lilies that we have, tiger lily, all these are edible, in like a skunk cabbage, and then maybe a few fronds of the sword fern and salal, and then put that on, and then cover it again with skunk cabbage, and then cover it with soil, right back up, and let it cook for, and they used, I think they used a PVC pipe, but they used a little pipe in the side that went down to near where it was, and they had that in there when they covered the soil up, so that they could put water in and create that steam effect a couple of times. And I don't know how it was done in the past. Maybe they pulled it away and poured some water and covered it up, but
Speaking of plastic, you were talking about plastic. And then you said the tubes that you use for planting are plastic.
yes.
So you reuse
Oh,
them?
yes, yeah.
Okay.
Again and
Why
again.
you didn't use those fibers.
Well, yeah, it's possible. Actually, from a cost perspective, if we can reuse those plastic tubes even 3 times, it's very good. And we'll use them, 15, 20, 30 times. Yeah. We get the UV stable ones.
And then when somebody tells about a plant that, my great-grandfather saw this plant, over here, but it's not here anymore, and you said you try to get, them within the region, your seeds, if you get seeds from other sources.
Yeah.
So what do you do in that case? Do you get them from a farther source?
Right. The furthest away we've gotten plants was from like over on the by Port Townsend on the Olympic Peninsula through the Kai folks, halfway to Mount Vernon, Anacortes, Goose Rock, you know, that kind of a thing. Otherwise, some people say, oh, you're being purists, and the natives traveled with all these things, and it was all. And I'll tell you that amongst the leading thinkers in the restoration and ecology in the state of Washington, at least, they're actually kind of rethinking some of this. Not to get extreme and bring things from Florida here, but maybe from southern Washington or what have you. So, yeah.
And my last question is, you know the plant toadflax with the little teeny tiny flowers? It's a kind of a ferny stem and really tiny pink and blue flowers.
Oh. Well, let's talk about it.
The pollinators love it.
Okay.
You said usually they choose native plants.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it spreads itself.
Okay. Well, I'll look it up. And where I go, Word to the Wise, really a user-friendly site, is the Burke Museum, part of University of Washington, herbarium collection, their image collection. And you'll go and you just type in nodding onion, Burke image, and it'll pull up that site, and you'll get a couple of nice photos. You'll get just bullet points on it's native, here's the range, here's the map, and this is what the leaves look like, or something like that. So if you ever want to, look something up, it's for scientists, but it's also very good for people like me who weren't trained as botanists or something. Yeah.
And do you have a bee person on site all the time?
No, but we are working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We're part of a region-wide pollinator study. So we've got grad students and leading entomologists coming out routinely and studying swaths of both the native plants and the non-native plants. And they're literally sitting there in chairs, for hours at end and different spots and things like that. It's going to be a multi-year, study, and we've already got some preliminary information, and it's just beyond fascinating. They're really starting to get a handle on, which we don't have, of how many different types of pollinators will visit a golden paintbrush or a nodding onion or what have you. So,
do you sell a golden paintbrush there?
No, as the federal folks told me, they said, we still own it, Robert. It's still experimentally being planted, technically. And although we have the third largest site, maybe the second now, we have over 22,000 plants, which is exciting because now we don't have to count them individually anymore. We can just do an extrapolation. But boy, that was a pain. It was 3 days to count the plants. But we're now considered a population. We've over 1,000 plants for 5 consecutive years. And if we can get 3 or 4 more populations up on different properties throughout Washington, we'll get it off the endangered species list. We're the administering agency with Fish and Wildlife. They work with 7 organizations. We're one of them, but we administer their program through PRI to these other 6 organizations. So it's kind of a nice arrangement.
So how many do you have to get that number?
I'm sorry?
Different plantations of...
Yeah, all over the state.
Okay.
And about 7 on Whidbey.
7.
Yeah. We're shooting for 20. Yeah. So thank you. Sorry for going over. Come out anytime. We love visitors. We've got